Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this wonderful webinar tonight. We have some very special guests with us to conduct the panel. So tonight's webinar is going to be about race relations, specifically in the Asian community, how we can bridge those racial tensions and also alleviate it, and really just to have a platform for more perspective and for more improvement in our communities and to educate our members. And on tonight's webinar, we are joined by first Miss Anisha Singh. Anisha Singh is the campaign manager for legal progress at American Progress. In this capacity, she shapes the conversation around the nation's judicial process by managing unprecedented grassroots organization efforts across the country to educate Americans on the need to fill judicial vacancies with diverse, progressive judges so that the historic backlogs can be remedied and cases can be heard in a timely manner. She previously served as a policy attorney and project manager for UNAVSA, where she focuses on human and civil rights advocacy on behalf of the minority communities internationally, with an emphasis on post-9/11 discrimination concerns. She single-handedly managed the Washington, D.C. chapter, cultivating key relationships, with the White House and on Capitol Hill, and founded the United Sikhs National Anti-Bullying Campaign to proactively assist victims of bullying through presentations and resources in the Department of Education. As counsel for United Sikhs, Singh won a historic anti-discrimination case against the U.S. Army, and prior to that, as a student at the University of Virginia School of Law Immigration Law Clinic, she won a case at Counsel for Female Clients seeking legal status under the Violence Against Women Act, both of which landed national media attention. Singh brings with her more than 9 years of experience in public interest and social justice work, as well as a strong grassroots organizing background. She also has a legal background that includes immigration, employment discrimination, labor, civil rights, international criminal justice, and trial advocacy. So thank you so much, Anisha, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Very excited to hear your perspective. As well, we have Kaden Mack, an executive director at 18millionrising.org, a digital civic engagement hub for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. As part of the 18 Million Rising Org's foundation staff, they are an integral part of developing the organization's vision, voice, analyst, and playbook. Recently, they were the driving force and product manager behind community-centered design for civic tech projects, VoterVox, a matching tool to find personalized volunteer translation assistance for limited English-speaking proficient voters. Their organizing history also includes co-founding grassroots media startups, co-founding a statewide student organizing network, serving as a union officer and staff organizer, and contributing to organizing the Allied Media Conference in Detroit, Michigan. Welcome, Kaden. Also very excited to have you on this panel.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yes. So I'm going to start with some personal questions so that the viewership can get to know you guys a little bit better. What motivated you guys to join the civic servant sector and your respective fields?
Sure, so I can go first. Again, thank you guys so much for having me on this panel. I'm really excited to talk about the issues that are really important now more than ever in the new era that we've kind of entered. I started really getting involved with public interest and public service back after 9/11 happened. My community, I'm a Sikh American, fell victim to a lot of hate crimes, discrimination, profiling, bullying, and I kind of watched it unfold, right? Like as I was mourning with the country, I was also going to my Sikh temple and seeing that, you know, the uncles and elders in my community were scared. We had to have security. They were wearing flag pins on their shirts just to say, like, I'm an American too, please don't hurt me. There was a lot of tension and a lot of stress going on, and it really kind of bothered me, and I started getting involved as much as I could because I had that kind of privilege. I wasn't falling victim myself. I came from a family of means, and I spoke the language well. I wasn't, you know, an immigrant. So I was born and raised here, and I felt like I could do some help, you know, help out my community. So I started getting involved with civic organizations. I started getting involved with racial justice, religious liberties work. Eventually, long story short, it landed me in law school. And in law school, I focused on civil rights law and social justice. And eventually, I worked for United Sikhs full time. That's the kind of organizations I always volunteer for. That's where I was a policy attorney, like you said. And it kind of just drove me to helping the community. And from there, I've kind of broadened my scope to kind of help people with all kinds of issue areas at the progressive think tank Center for American Progress, while continuing my work in the anti-hate, anti-Muslim bigotry space. So I think 9/11 and, you know, the way that it impacted my personal community kind of drove me to wanting to help my community, those affected, similar to my community, and then broadly just do public interest work in the best way that I could.
That's awesome.
Yeah, similarly, I feel like I have a very, I mean, part of it is I think that, you know, the early 2000s were like an interesting time to sort of be young and try and figure out who you wanted to be in the world. But I probably, I mean, if I really want to trace sort of the history of my activist work back, I probably would say that it started when I came out as a high school student, as queer and then as transgender, and that in this sort of like very normie school environment where, like, you know, we were doing, this was in maybe like, you know, 2003 or 2004, when like there were not a lot of out trans people in the news, and doing advocacy with my friends at our high school for things like gender neutral bathrooms, like way before it was cool. And you know, in a lot of ways, I was very fortunate that like I have had access to really strong social justice education since I was a teenager, and really those opportunities were given to me in a lot of different contexts, including in college. But really, the way that I got involved in the work that I do now is thinking about how, you know, at the same time that I was doing this work in my high school, the internet was becoming a really important thing in my life. And it was really through this sort of combination of higher education and spending time online, meeting people with different perspectives, and with sort of like incisive opinions about how the world should be, that led me to start thinking about how the internet and technology can be a massive force for good in the world, and for sort of counteracting a lot of the sort of toxic and dangerous ways that we're socialized. And so over the past 4 years at 18MR, and even longer before that, when I was in graduate school, I've really been interested in the ways that technology and the internet in particular changes the way that we're social with each other, and the ways in which it creates both opportunities and then also sort of hazards for folks doing organizing work. And for society in general. You know, I think that technology is a really, like the effects of technology are really complicated. But I guess like the thing that I've always been interested in is figuring out how to combine my social justice education with this interest in technology and the internet. And that's kind of how I ended up here, so.
That's awesome. Thank you, guys. So North America is often called a melting pot, and specifically in the United States, it's a country that still struggles with race relations throughout its history, and it's still very prevalent today. So on this webinar, there's going to be a lot of questions concerning that, as well as some of the campaigns, as well as advocacy things that you guys do and pursue. So we're going to dive into that now. Starting off, you guys have mentioned this before. You guys had addressed a lot of hate behaviors and just discriminatory behaviors towards yourself and minority groups and marginalized groups. How do you address behaviors from members of your own community that display like cultural appropriation? And how do we hold others within our own communities accountable of these behaviors?
I guess like for me, the question of who is my community is always something that's a really hard question, right? Who are our people? And how do we decide who those people are is a really, I think, important part of understanding queerness also in the world. That like, there's this concept of queer family that's about your chosen family as opposed to the family that you're born into. And so in a lot of ways, I have a lot of different kinds of people, and like most folks in the world, the various ways that my identity works means I have multiple communities. I think one of the challenges with a lot of sort of bringing more mainstream social justice discourse into a lot of sort of, I guess, like the broader communities that you find yourself in, is that people tend to be really resistant to messages from people who they perceive are folks telling them how to be, in my experience. And one of the sort of strengths of the kind of work that we do at 18MR is sort of centered around the fact that we have a staff that is multiracial, multicultural, and pretty diverse in terms of like gender, sexuality, and socioeconomic status, immigration status. And that really what we're trying to do is figure out ways to talk to people about their own experience so that they can sort of see themselves in the world and kind of understand, or I guess like hear people more clearly. It's often easier to hear a message from somebody who looks like you and who has a similar experience and who can sort of speak to that as part of the foundation for why a certain issue matters to them. I think that in general, the work of identity formation in the Asian American community is particularly important because I think that one of the things that we struggle with, and one of the things I've seen a lot of folks struggle with online, is that Asian American is, in the sort of like way that we understand it today in the United States, is not a political identity. It's sort of arbitrary. It's an arbitrary racial bucket that we think of as sort of a census category that often doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to folks. The variety of the American experience is really wide, and there are a lot of factors on which we experience diversity. For me, I think what's core here is that people sort of come to understand themselves and their Asian American as a sort of a fundamentally political identity, and that there are values that underpin claiming that as your own identity, and being able to speak from those things. I think that that's really core to getting folks to understanding yourself.
So I'll just I'll add that I think I think I agree with everything you just said, and I also will just add that sometimes people forget that people aren't in silos, right? Like they look at someone and they'll think this person is Black, this person is Muslim, etc. But we need to remember that there is something known as a Black Muslim, a Black Muslim who is a lesbian. And if we can take people out of those silos and just remember that we all kind of mesh together and we can't put them in buckets, it can help with a lot of the stereotypes and cultural appropriation and a lot of the stigmas that we kind of come into situations with. I think people tend to put things into buckets just as a psychological way of life. And if we try to challenge that and try to give them examples of individuals who come from a different experience, or give examples to kind of correct their version of the narrative, we give them an opportunity to think differently without really attacking them and making them feel defensive. and especially those of us who have that opportunity, the opportunity to do so. I'll give you a really good example. On June 10th, there are over 20, almost I think 23 different anti-Muslim rallies planned throughout the country. And these are individuals who basically are racist against the Islamic faith and are going to get together to make that very clear. Now, I don't think I feel safe to go out there and protest it. Or go and try to talk to them. I don't think people who wear hijabs or turbans or anything else should be the ones to do that. I think allies and support systems who aren't going to be threatened, maybe, you know, individuals who look like your straight white man can go out there and talk to these people about and correct the record. And I think so allyship, breaking those silos, giving those examples, really trying to have those conversations with people. You mentioned the internet earlier. I think the internet is so helpful in making sure that we all get the information right away, that we can record, do, you know, Twitter Live, Facebook Live, make sure that we're holding people accountable. But one thing it does do that's a downfall is that it puts us in those silos again, where we are kind of having conversations within ourselves. We're seeing the messages we want to see. We're seeing the news we want to see. And because of that, we kind of reaffirm what we think we know and just consider that to be facts. So it's really important to go out there and have those raw conversations. And make sure that members of our community and allies and others that we can have a conversation with are spreading those messages in a productive manner.
Awesome. So UNAVSA's membership is mainly students and young professionals ranging from 18 to about an average of 25 years old. And I always believe that it's very important to be civically engaged and also on top of the news, and also be just very aware of your atmosphere, especially the political and social climates of today. Why is it that you think it's important for the younger generation to support these types of civil movements?
I would say because it's more important now than ever before. I mean, by 2044 or 2040, actually, minorities will be the majority and the melting pot continues to grow. So we have to make sure we work together before we continue to see these rifts that we're seeing that has happened in the last, especially year or so, where that has really come out. You know, it depends on, it really depends on your family history, your own cultural history. You know, I will say Black Americans, they have been dealing with this for centuries and they're still dealing with it, even though they weren't even coming here voluntarily. And then those of us who have immigrated here, we are the ones that are expected to live by a model, contribute in a certain way, and if we need any assistance, we should probably just leave. And so, how do we quash this rhetoric? Is by having those conversations with people and making sure we start that young, while the minds are growing, while we're starting to get into the workforce, while we're starting to build our own families, to make sure that we fix those misconceptions for future generations. If we don't get involved at a younger time, those who are older, stuck in their way, will continue to be making the decisions for us that will impact us for generations to come. A really good example I like to give personally, because I work in on the courts and judicial issues, is the Supreme Court. All of the individuals serving live lifetime appointments that can last up to 3 generations. So we just confirmed someone on the Supreme Court who doesn't believe in abortion, who doesn't believe in a lot of values that perhaps individuals on the younger generations believe in. But not only will they be impacted by decisions by that court, so will their kids and possibly even grandkids. And especially, you know, in light of today's news, where we might be pulling out of the Paris Agreement, and we might be dealing with a lot of repercussions to our climate, which again does impact generations. Now is more important than ever before for younger generations to get involved and really think about ways they can do that. And with the internet at your fingertips, town halls being where the resistance is happening, or whatever else it might be you're passionate about, it's very easy to get even slightly involved, where it's just a couple of minutes a month, to very involved and really volunteer your time, so that we can actually see change in the next, whether it's an election, whether it's just in an issue area that you care about, or even if it's just community service, human rights types issues, getting involved really helps really create your own blueprint and fingerprint on your future.
So just to piggyback off all your comments and suggestions, I think at least for the demographic that I myself work with and UNAVSA, there's a strong group that are very opinionated and very civically engaged, and then there's a group that often answers with an apathetic tone to things, as far as, oh, it's very dramatic, I don't want to be involved, it's controversial, or it's uncomfortable. I guess, how would the both of you try to engage them in civic engagement? And I guess, how do you get those types of personalities involved?
I mean, I think that's always a struggle, you know. I think that one of the ways in which, especially in immigrant communities in this country, that we are often encouraged to be is to keep our heads down and work hard. And like Anisha said, like, if we are having a hard time, if we are struggling, it's made clear that we're not welcome here. I mean, lately, more and more, it's that, like, even if we are having a fine time, it's made very clear that we're not welcome here. But I think that, you know, for me, these questions, I think, really strike deep into the heart of who we want to be as people and what kind of a world we want to live in. You know, Anisha mentioned, especially for instance, like the Paris Accord, and like, you know, the very existence of our planet is at stake, right? Like, I think that these issues are, you know, they may sound dramatic, and if you sort of like look at the headline only, they sound very dramatic. But then, you know, I think this is a great challenge for organizers in general, and it's always been the challenge for organizers, is figuring out what the personal stake is. You know, my friend Sasha, who works for Incapia, has this great formulation where they talk about selfish solidarity. Which is a sort of framework under which you try to figure out, as the organizer, as somebody who's telling your own story, how does this thing affect the individual you're talking to? What is their personal stake in it? What are the ways that by lifting up others and by working on these really broad sort of humanitarian causes, do you yourself as an individual get uplifted? And I think that that's like a really important way to create sort of opportunities to bring more folks in, because I don't know initially that like everybody's interested in like laying their lives on the line for other people, but getting people to understand like what their stake in a system is. And I think that, you know, often we miss the fact that a lot of this inequality, a lot of this injustice is deeply systemic, and it's about how things are set up. You know, it's not just about sort of one individual struggle or like one individual suffering, but it's about a structure that is designed to keep people down, or it's a structure that's designed to make it hard for people who are struggling to lift themselves up. And I think that those kinds of putting things into that broader context and getting people to understand what their personal stake in the issue might be are two of the most important kind of rhetorical tools that we have to get people to understand why this work's so important.
And just echoing Kaden, I completely agree. I'm actually staring right at a poster that I had made for the first Muslim ban protest that I went to for 1.0, not 2.0. And it's literally says, first they came for the Muslims and I did not speak up, but I crossed out did not speak up and I wrote fought like hell. And that's kind of always been my motto. Like, you might not be the one attacked right now. And a lot of times the reason people get involved is because they themselves are attacked, their community themselves are attacked. But it might not be you today, but it might be you tomorrow, because it's kind of a slippery slope. Once they start attacking one group, they start attacking others, and we're seeing that a lot more lately too. And so making sure we're all standing up for each other as minorities, as people who are disadvantaged or voiceless, disenfranchised, whatever it may be. Another thing I would say is just remembering your values. I always challenge people to tell me what their values are. What is your value system? And if your value system says things like, I believe in equality and I believe in justice, and people usually can say that in theory. So what does that mean? Because right now things are not equal. And right now there is no justice. We are seeing it with this example and that example. So how are you going to do something about it? Or is that not your value system? Like, is it a pretty thing that you think of? And I really challenge them, is that a pretty thing that you would like to claim? But then you don't want to put in the work, and it does give people pause, and it sometimes seems harsh, but it's the only way to really challenge ourselves to do better and contribute, especially in times when we really do need all hands on deck.
Very, very excellent points. So you both have mentioned the internet really helping your campaigns as well as driving a lot of these civil movements or civic movements. How has the internet posed a challenge to these campaigns or these movements?
I think it definitely desensitizes us. I think we've seen so many shootings we see because of Twitter. I mean, every day there's a new shooting, every day there's new news, and we kind of get desensitized. We start thinking that's the new normal, which of course we need to take a step back and be like, this is terrible. What's actually happening is that we're hearing about it more, but we need to do something about it. I think one problem is it desensitizes us because we're getting the information so quickly all the time. You probably can't even remember the headlines in the news or what information you got 2 days ago, let alone earlier this morning. So that's one thing. Another is what I mentioned earlier, that we kind of get stuck into our silos a little bit more. We kind of reaffirm what we want to affirm because of the way that information is passed on to us. Things like Facebook and Twitter kind of give you in your newsfeed what you want to see. And so that's a problem because we're not having organic conversations anymore. We're not meeting people on the street, and we saw that a lot in the last election, where after the election, that was one of the biggest takeaways, was that people were having so many conversations in their own silos. They really thought their person was going to win. And that was it, because nobody was having those conversations. And then finally, fake news. Fake news is everywhere all the time. Right now, I could put something out that says the sky is pink, and someone could read that, believe me, and go with that and spread that too. So just being more cognizant about the kind of information we are reading, and making sure we're fact checking things. I think those are the kind of big three things that I think we all kind of have to adjust to, because as we get more and more connected through these new technological advances, we need to make sure that we're sticking to facts, and we're sticking to and challenging ourselves to have those organic conversations, and that we are always taking a step back and saying, this isn't normal, what can I do to help?
Yeah, I guess, the first challenge of the internet too, I think even before thinking about how we interact with the internet, is just to remember that everybody's on the internet now. And that includes, neo-Nazis, and that includes Klansmen, and that includes the folks who would rather see us dead. And so one of the sort of challenges of especially like corporate platforms is they don't necessarily have a business interest in making sure that neo-Nazis can't use their platforms to organize, right? Like, they want the maximum number of users because it makes them money. And I think one of the biggest risks that we often don't talk about the internet is the fact that it is being sort of positioned as this neutral tool that anybody can use. And it's in some ways like the folks who make these big platforms want them to be neutral tools. The problem with a neutral tool is that anybody can use it for their ends, right? And the sort of dark side of that is the way that activists get doxxed. The way that all of a sudden, I just read this article in the Center for Investigative Reporting's website, Reveal, today, about the sort of like rise of white nationalists who are Odinists, and that they use Facebook to really find each other because there's so few of them and they're so far between, and that these are folks who seem to be really predisposed to actual hate violence, like not just talking about hate violence on the internet. I think that's something that like is the sort of like, to me, the even scarier underbelly of the internet is it is even as important as it has been for us to find new ideas and to come into contact with one another across great distances, so too it's being used to organize the forces of hate. And I think that that's really something that we always have to keep in mind when we're online. And I think the other thing that I think is a huge challenge about the internet that is also a bit under discussed is the fact that, you know, people often talk about how, you know, we get stuck online and the internet is sort of like the new public square, but the problem is that it's not really public anymore. Facebook and Twitter and Google, the sort of like major platforms that probably all of us are touching right now, at least one of them, are these platforms that are owned by giant corporations that really think that they can reproduce and therefore control public space online. One of the things that I've said before in different places is that, like, one of the sort of terrifying things about Twitter is that when a Black person is shot by the police and hashtag trends, Twitter makes money. They actually don't have an economic motivation to protect folks. And I think that there's like, we should have an uneasy relationship with these platforms as activists. You know, in a lot of ways, we're doing work for them to make them money by doing the work that we do. And we shouldn't trust them. You know, like they're in this to make money. And even as they're like hugely important tools to try and change the world, they clearly don't have our interests at heart. And I think that there's a lot that can be done to change them. Whether that is getting them to enforce their terms of service, whether that's the folks who are starting a campaign to buy Twitter and make it a worker-owned cooperative, or whether that's setting up our own platforms and tools online that are not controlled by major corporations. I think it's a really big deal. And it's also a core component of like the next layer of net neutrality that is also, I think, at risk.
Are there other, I guess, platforms that are being controlled by major corporations and silencing people or making a big buck out of these pretty important issues that you are aware of?
I mean, this is a big question, but I think that, you know, the way that I understand social media is, and the internet in general, and I think that, you know, a lot of people are surprised when some service that they get for free sells their data or whatever. If you're ever getting anything for free on the internet, it's because you are actually the product. You know, like you're actually doing the labor that creates value for Twitter, for Google, for Facebook. And I think it's easy to forget that because like all of these corporations sort of have this very friendly face on them that they're like, oh, it's all about you. You know, it's all about you and your life and sharing with your friends. But the fact of the matter is if we didn't produce all this content, if we didn't spend so much time on Twitter and Facebook, they wouldn't be making the money that they make, right? And so I think that's like one of the big sort of internal contradictions of doing any kind of activist work online is even as we're trying to fight for justice and perhaps even dismantle capitalism, we are making money for some of the most unaccountable capitalist corporations that there are right now. That Silicon Valley is really running wild in a lot of ways. And it's something that I don't have a good solution for, you know, and we need these tools in a lot of ways to like spread our message, to tell our stories, and to lift up our communities. But at the same time, we need to be mindful of the fact that the tools that we're using are using us. Sorry to get real dark and dystopian there for a sec, but.
I think she's muted.
Sorry. All right, right back. Yeah, we appreciate realism on our board as well as here at UNAVSA. So it's okay to get a little bit dark. So considering the internet having so many resources at hand and a lot of it not reliable or a lot of it very skewed and I guess not objective with information, what are some sources that you guys recommend when it comes to finding facts rather than fake news?
I'm trying to think about like who I even read these days consistently.
I think it's about, for me, it's about finding who you trust, right? Like, I'm not going to try and understand what is happening to, for, or from the Black community without checking out Black Lives Matter and checking out people I know who work in that movement, people with those lived experiences. And so for me, it's always been just kind of figuring out like who it is that I think are the most reliable sources. And then also checking the other side. So unfortunately, whatever, I follow people that I know are so wrong. Like they're like alternative facts all day, every day. But I like to follow them because it challenges me to find the right answer too, if that makes sense. So I will like see something that says, like I said earlier in my example, the sky is pink, and I'll be like, that just doesn't sound right. And I know this person likes to make things up. Let me go and find out what it is. And then I start doing my research. And we all know what the reliable sources are. I mean, you can't necessarily trust Wikipedia today the way you could maybe yesterday, so that might not be reliable. But just like you would go to a notable author or a research institute, you would same way go to people that you know are valued in that community or in that space. I work for a think tank, so I can't help but put a plug there. We do our research and we put out resources. That's literally what we do, so that people can use that information in toolkit form or on the news or in their everyday conversation to use those numbers. We sometimes do state by state numbers, district by district numbers. We do numbers for communities of color, for the LGBT community, whatever it might be, to help that conversation advance and give you guys the tools that you need to have the facts in front of you, and then do with that as you may. Like, again, whether it's a toolkit or you're putting together your own stuff. A lot of the town halls we've seen during recess, we'll hear our own statistics being used, and that's great. And we make sure that we source and recite everybody that we use. So looking at organizations like Center for American Progress that do the research and put in a lot of resources to making sure that we get the numbers right would be another suggestion of mine.
Yeah, I think that trust network building thing is really important. You know, I think that one of the things that I've had some experience with online on social media is also like people pretending to be people they're not. I think that there's that sort of, I think that in some ways that can be sort of blown out of proportion into this kind of like stranger danger kind of thing. So it's not like I don't think that you shouldn't not make friends online, you know, like and get to know people. And generally speaking, I trust that folks are the people they present themselves to be on the internet. But the challenge is like, if your gut says something's messed up, probably is, right? Like, whether that is in a news story that's being reported or like the new cool person that you just started following on Twitter, asking good questions of yourself and others. And I think first and foremost yourself, right? That like the biggest protection against being fooled by the media environment, no matter who we're talking about, is having a strong sense of what the world is and how you understand the world to be. And I think that comes from being willing to challenge your own assumptions, but also like asking hard questions about where those assumptions came from. Super important. I mean, honestly, like most of the news that I get, I read because folks in my immediate network, folks who I trust deeply, have shared it. And sometimes like their takes are wrong, you know? We do exist in a sort of internet environment where it's not really okay to be wrong, but I think it's important that like in the sort of social networks that we have that are personal, that are real, we have the opportunity to sort of examine those things together and pull them apart.
Very true. So you guys brought up the Black Lives Matter movement, and with each of these types of social and civic movements, again, there are definitely extremists that take away from the message. In particular, for example, when at the height, I guess, at the beginning height of the Black Lives Matter movement, the media started to frame it as a very violent movement just because the things that they were showcasing as far as looting that was happening in some of these major cities like Baltimore and whatnot. How do you battle messages in that sense? Or how do you centralize that energy back to the roots?
One of my favorite things to point out is, there are always bad eggs in any race or religion or ethnicity or anything. We all have those people. And we just have to remember that just like we don't say that the KKK speaks for all white people, that is never the assumption. We cannot sit here and assume, for example, that ISIS speaks for Muslims, right? It's very easy, and that's how you know you have privilege, when there are people in your own community who look like you, who might be doing atrocious things, but no one is holding you accountable. In fact, they automatically assume you are not affiliated. Versus if you don't even know maybe the people that are doing those things, they don't speak for you, they seem to be going rogue, you suddenly get clumped up in that group. That's when you know you have a problem. So I think it's always stepping back and remembering things like that. There's actually a statistic that came out recently that kind of really personifies this. It was 75% of the public say that self-described Christians who commit acts of violence in the name of Christianity aren't really Christian, while 50% of the public say the same about people who claim to be Muslim and commit religiously motivated violence. Fewer than 4 in 10 say that such people are actually Muslim, while 13% are uncertain. So it's a vast difference, and it really kind of brings out exactly what you're talking about. We need to be able to combat that. We have to change the narrative completely and point these statistics out to really get people to challenge it, and take a step back and realize that their own bias, whether it's implicit or not, is really shaping the way that we think of this.
Well, I mean, the way that I had this great professor in college who, in the course that I took with her, one of the sort of like themes was about where you sort of enter a narrative. And I think that this is like one of the things that bothers me the most about like the media, like depending on media frameworks for everything, right? Is that like the media is only ever entering the narrative pretty far along actually in the process, right? So we think about civil unrest and the way that the media has always framed civil unrest, which is like, there are these sort of like chaos agents who want to destroy the country. What backstory do we not hear, right? And I think that like in the sort of like rebellions that have come as a result of individual Black people being murdered by the police department, what we often don't see is the backstory of like that community struggling with that police department over years, over decades. That like there's more than just this sort of like flashpoint moment. There's redlining, right? That goes back to the early 20th century. There is the systematic over-policing of Black communities, and that like the expressions of rage are not just the expressions of rage about the killing of one person recently, that they're actually about the like incredible long bottling up of like very real pain. And I think that like when those things are put into context, and we get, I guess, the longer view story, we start understanding why those things happen, And I think that like there will always be this effort on the part of the powerful to paint folks who have little to no power, who are fighting back, as radical, as dangerous, as violent. But capitalism is violent, like the foundation of this country is violent. And I think the thing that I always have struggled with is that, the way in which these things are framed now, and the way that sort of like, I guess, civil rights fights are framed now, is that we've come so far since the 60s, right? And I think there are a lot of strong counter arguments to how, sort of counterpoints to the truth of that statement. And if that's the case, why is it that we find sort of nonviolent civil disobedience not nearly as compelling anymore as it used to be? And what are the alternatives that we have? You know, I think that there is a really important room in social movements for all kinds of tactics, largely because one tactic didn't win the victories of the civil rights movement, right? Like, it took the combination of nonviolent civil disobedience and litigation and lobbying, but also like folks arming themselves, protecting their communities, fighting back against the racist police, against the Klan, stuff like that, in order to win these victories. You know, I think it's like, it feels a little trite to say that you should question the media's framing of everything, but really, you know, I think it's in the interest of folks with power for us not to dig deep on these issues. But the only way that we can change them is by digging deep. Otherwise, we're just going to be putting out fires constantly and running quickly from fire to fire and exhausting ourselves.
Very true. So the both of you work in fighting for equality, as well as many other great ideals that UNAVSA aligns itself in as well. And you also go into very different spaces that are beyond your own. What are some important tips or things to remember when engaging in different spaces? Because I think this is something that our membership has some issues with, as far as treading into different waters. And then I think that brings on that apprehensive attitude or apathetic attitude to join these types of movements.
I would definitely say be open-minded, recognize your privilege, and the reason you want to be an ally to that particular person or group is because you can, and they probably need that help. So yeah, you might get some criticism, you might get some feedback, but that's even more reason to learn and grow and be a better ally. I think the best thing the first thing I always ask people is, what can I do to help? Like, what will help you? Not going in and saying, hey, I think I can do this and this for you, so much as seeing where they actually need the help. What kind of an ally can I be in this moment for you? And taking it from there, listening to what others have to say, asking questions, and learning, I think really help us all kind of grow and learn from each other and each other's experiences. But definitely just always starting with, what can I do to help you?
Yeah, and I think that like being humble and being grounded are really central to figuring that out, and figuring out how to like be the kind of leader who serves. You know, I think that like it's very easy for us to get caught up in our own egos and think how important our work or our perspectives are. But one of the really challenging things about working with other people is that simply that people are different from each other. And knowing that you are your own unique person with like flaws and life experiences, and everybody else you come into contact with has like this super complex inner life that you don't have access to, is really important. You know, I think that like it sounds so basic, but it's really easy, I think, especially when we get like really excited about a cause, to forget that the reason that we're joining the cause in the first place is because of humans. And like the fact that humans are beautiful, you know, like they're great, they're messy, they're fucked up, and they're beautiful. That goes for ourselves, and being gentle with ourselves, and patient and like slow moving with our own sort of fragile parts. But also recognize that the folks around you may have sort of soft spots and fragile parts that you can't even see, you know, like you may not know what you don't know. And that like approaching that with like humility, with grace, with a sense of humor, and with the understanding that like anger comes from somewhere, you know, like a lot of times it's not just about like one thing that you maybe said or did in that moment, but it's about like a history of people are saying and doing those things, and understand that like you shouldn't say or do those things, but also it's not just about you. I think has been really helpful for me in building powerful coalitions, that like we need to make room for difference. You know, I think that's the problem with that's sort of central to the problems that we're trying to solve, and the challenges of building a sort of functional multicultural society is like we're really different from each other and have different needs and are socialized in different ways. And we can make space for that. And a lot of that is being gentle with yourself when you fuck up and giving it a second go, and having people in your life who you can process those feelings with outside of those spaces. You know, you don't need to, I guess, take up that space with your own feelings, but if you've got good friends, good co-conspirators who are also, you know, have a similar experience to you, like that space is also really important. Again, being grounded, super important. Toa, I think you're muted again. Wrong one.
Technology is on my side today. Very true sentiments, and something that I definitely resonate with from both commentaries. I guess there are a lot of different reactions to these types of different campaigns. I think, what are in your opinions, the most pressing matters for our generation today? And what can the youth do right now to be a part of it and to move it forward rather than taking a couple steps backwards, long steps backwards?
This is something I struggle with every day now, because I think there's just so much at risk all the time. We have the healthcare fight, where there are 23 million people who might lose their healthcare. We have the climate fight, where we might be backing out of agreements that might save our planet. We have a rise in hate crimes to a rate that is now exceeding the post 9/11 era. We have a justice system that is difficult to navigate when ICE is going into restaurants and arresting people. We have a lot at stake. So it's really hard to say this community matters more than this community, or this issue matters more than this issue. I think it is, and what I'm learning is, it is fighting the fights you think you can be most impactful in. Where is your expertise? What area do you live in that it might matter the most? So I have, I'm originally from Florida. I know the climate fight down there is so prevalent, and we need to be talking to our congressman down in Florida about that, because it impacts you directly, and it's a bigger fight. And it's different in different areas, but I think it's just taking it a day at a time and seeing, what can I do today? That's what I do every day, and we can only hope that we leave some sort of an impact in whatever fights we can get into. But I mean, it's a hard one. I really don't, there's no black or white answer. It's kind of, you got to roll with the punches and do the best you can.
Yeah, I think, one of the things for me, and I think that, like, we at 18MR, often when we choose campaigns, we often have to make this painful choice about what feels like something that's going to feel right in the moment, and how do we build structures that are about more than just sort of resisting what we think is messed up. And I think for me, that's a big piece of how I make personal decisions also, is like, it's very easy to like critique things. It's a lot harder to develop solutions. And I think that, like, there are ways that we can develop solutions that you don't need to be an elected official to do them. Last year, one of the things that I had the most fun doing in my whole life was getting together with some neighbors, and there was the city of Oakland, where I live, was going to sell this piece of, and they ultimately did sell this piece of public land. But we wanted them to build affordable housing on it, because, as you've probably heard, the Bay Area is in a housing crisis, and it's just as bad as everything you've heard. But we got together with some neighbors, and we got 300 people to tell us what they would build on that site. And we pulled some professional connections and got an architect to design an actual building that we would build there. And then we found an affordable housing developer who was like, yeah, I'd build this building. This is cool. And it, in the grand scheme of things, it's small, but one of the things that was exciting about it is housing activists in different cities around the country were like, oh, wow, like, we can do something like this. Like, it's possible for us to dream bigger than just shutting down the fucked up stuff. We can really frame something alternative. And I think that in this sort of, like, where we're all kind of battening down the hatches and hunkering down in the age of Trump, I think there's a lot of room for people dreaming bigger than resistance. You know, like what are we going to come out the other side of these miserable 4 years with, right? Like, despite all these attacks on these like important big policies, where are the opportunities? And those are the things that really excite me. And I think that especially for folks who like are like, holy shit, there's so many policy things coming down the pipe. There's so much suffering and so much pain that like, those are kind of, I think there are these sort of like magical spaces where we might have some room to dream. And I think it's important that people don't stop dreaming. Because it's really the exciting sort of like high energy positive stuff that's going to get people activated and fired up in the long term.
Those are very good sentiments. Well, there are some personal questions geared towards each of you. So I'll go into that section now. To Ms. Anisha, your work involves a lot of policies that affect API and other minority groups. What resources or things would you like to share with our members that help bridge this invisible gap between us as citizens and the policies that affect us? Oh, you're mute.
I am mute. I would definitely say getting involved outside of your community. One of the things I learned early on was the Sikh community is small, and the Muslim community is small relative to the other religious minorities in the country. So I started doing allyships with the Muslim community, with the Jewish community, with other communities that I know had similar struggles, had similar battles to fight in the hate crime space, for example. And so that kind of applies across the board. Those partnerships, those allyships are really what keeps our voices stronger. I'm always someone who says, for example, Black lives, in order for Muslim lives to matter, Sikh lives to matter, Black lives have to matter first. And we have to be thinking in those frameworks that we show up for other people and then they show up for us. And then that we need to see the best ways that we can be at the table for the conversations that need to happen. One of my favorite sayings is, if you're not at the table, you will be on the menu. And so people will talk and make decisions for you and your community unless you can make sure you're at the table. And the way to do that is, what we're seeing across the country right now. Get involved. Call your representatives, call your congressman. I know that sounds very cliche at this moment, but it's actually working. That's the one thing that we can say for sure is working. Join those protests. We have a really great website that I hope everyone can go to. Actually, two websites. resistancenearme.org. It's really easy. resistancenearme.org. You literally put in your zip code, and any protests, any town halls, any actions that could possibly be existing around you will come up, and you can see what you're comfortable getting involved with. Another one is recesstoolkit.com or .org, which is another resource where, especially during recess, you can see where is it that you need to be focused when your congressmen are at home. What kind of issues could you really get involved with? How can you make the issues that care about you come out in the open when you're going to these town halls? And we give you all of those statistics you might need for all the issues that matter to you. So you can kind of click on an issue and then go and see what statistics we have for you, what facts we have for you, and you can take that with you in whatever action you take. So I think it's just making sure we're getting involved in a productive manner in the right spaces, while also taking allyships to be a very serious asset and resource as we go along.
Awesome, thank you so much. And Kaden, running the 18millionrising.org, what is your metric of success for these campaigns, and how do you measure the impact, especially being on such a wide and open platform like the internet?
Well, I mean, there's an easy answer and there's a hard answer. Is that sometimes success is like, we get a law passed, we get somebody, we hold somebody accountable, we get some sort of like concrete policy change. One of the things that we've always done at 18 Million Rising is like often taken the hard road. I think that often especially online, where like the easiest form of engagement is sort of like get an email, sign a petition, that like there are great challenges that go much deeper than what we can really capture in a well-written email. And that's always been super important to me, because I believe in our sort of model of social change is that in addition to winning these concrete victories, we also have to shift the culture, you know, that the way that things work and the way that laws are made often comes from a cultural shift as opposed to the other way around. It's very unlikely that you're going to legislate racism out of existence. So we're often really interested in figuring out ways that we can put forward perspectives or ideas that people maybe haven't considered before, and maybe are going to be challenging, unpopular, but really sort of like get deep and dig at the roots of why these inequalities exist and why the situation is the case in the first place. Some great examples of this are when we first were approached, and this is like kind of funny because it's like a pop culture example, but it really, I think, has been part of this explosion of people talking about representation in the media and who has the power to tell whose stories. That like, so this was years ago when they first announced that Marvel and Netflix were going to be doing this Iron Fist TV show as part of the Defenders, which I'm a nerd. It's true. But one of the cool things about that was, it was sort of driven by the community, and people were, at the time, were mostly just talking about whitewashing roles, and we're still talking about whitewashing roles. But this was the first time we had this sort of like opportunity to mainstream the idea of race bending a character, a canonical character. And one of the really amazing things about that is that over the past 2.5 years, where we've been like working with folks like Keith Chow over at the Nerds of Color, and other people who sort of straddle this line between social justice and pop culture, is that the thinking on this is completely shifted. We don't even, I mean, at this point, like, I don't think any of the like recent articles when what's his name from Game of Thrones got cast as Iron Fist, I don't think anybody even mentioned us in a single article, and sometimes that's the biggest victory, right? Is that like Vox just published an explainer explaining why this was a big issue, and we're sort of faded into the background, and that's, I think, really powerful. It's like, it means that this is sort of embedded itself in people's consciousness, and they're thinking about it as like part of the fabric of our society, that like it's a mainstream conversation. And those are the things that, I mean, I'm really fired up about. And there are metrics of success that are sometimes a little harder to explain to people who are like, I want to understand what a win really is. But they're huge, they're huge. And they take place over the course of years instead of months and weeks and months. I also think that, like, for us, we're often thinking about like, what is the world going to look like when we're done? Like, how do we organize for our own obsolescence, and my ultimate measure of success is I don't have to do this job anymore. It feels unachievable, but that's really every day when we make decisions, that's what guides us, is like, how can we approach this issue or these questions in ways that make our existence obsolete? And that has to do with changing laws. It has to do with changing culture. It has to do with changing ourselves and understanding ourselves. So.
Agreed. I actually read an article, I forgot where it was, but they were interviewing, forgot his name, Louis Tan or something like that.
Oh,
and
yeah,
he was considered for that role. So, but it's cool that it's multiple articles on just that issue, and it is making sort of steps forward to not, I guess, whitewashing these Asian types of roles, or even considering Asians as lead parts. I think social media and media in general plays a big part on social constraints. So, yeah. Going back to a question for the both of you, there are major disparities that divide minorities and marginalized groups, a lot of it being socioeconomics as well as education. How is it that your campaigns or your projects are starting to bridge that gap? I know it's a very loaded question.
I think for us as a think tank, it is all about the research, looking into some of those communities that maybe we hadn't looked into before. For us, we take the election results, we look at voter trends, and we see, what kind of mashups can we make to figure out the numbers and what exactly are people's experiences, so we can make sure that we're addressing those communities. And I do think it's remembering that we can't forget people of color in all of those conversations. Like, I think right now, one of the things that I'm seeing a lot of is people saying, middle class, we forgot the middle class, we need to worry about the middle class. Well, let's not forget that the middle class means a lot of different things to a lot of different communities. It means something completely different if you are Black in America or even Asian in America than it does if you're white in America. And so it's really making sure that we lift up those numbers and making sure that those aren't forgotten in the background, because usually that's what happens. Then when people start talking about middle class, those communities and their specific circumstances kind of get forgotten, and those communities get forgotten. So that would be, I think, the biggest thing is making sure that we're not forgetting those communities, and that we're doing that extra research and finding out those numbers and really delving into how it is that we can change that.
Yeah, I think that is like super crucially important, is that as this has sort of been a theme throughout this entire conversation, is that like we are the amalgamation of so many different identities as individuals. Kimberly Crenshaw calls this intersectionality. That's where that word comes from. It's a way to understand how both race and gender affect the experiences of Black women in particular, but it's also a useful framework to sort of understand this identity siloing that happens. And for us, what's important is that we are presenting a truth and speaking from a truth that resonates with people and that people understand as something that is true for somebody in the world, right? That like often in this sort of like mainstream, and I think our job often is like inserting ourselves into mainstream discourse about things and being like, have you considered this? Have you considered the existence of these people? And we see this a lot also with, I guess, like fights around data disaggregation and how important that is for a lot of Asian communities, because I think something that people don't often know is that like once you disaggregate the data, that there are huge disparities in terms of like wealth and income, and even regionally, that like the poverty rate amongst Chinese Americans in New York City, which is Chinese Americans tend to be more established, they tend to be higher income. But the poverty rate amongst Chinese Americans in New York City is as high, if not higher, than other minority racial groups in New York City. A lot of people don't know that. I think that like finding those common causes is really important, and understanding how we are connected to one another through the system of like power and wealth that generally we don't have access to is crucially important. And the ways in which people with power have an interest in keeping us against one another is another core part of finding those opportunities to make common cause.
Piggybacking off of what you both said, when it comes to these disparities, we have a question from the audience. What are the main causes of the poverty trap, and who are the most prone to being victims of that trap? And I guess the next follow-up to that would be, what do you think are the steps to resolve those problems once you're able to identify them?
I mean, I'm not a super big expert in this, but the one thing I will say is that, I forget who originally said this, but it's definitely true that it's incredibly expensive to be poor. And the problem with poverty is that it tends to be cyclical. Like more that you struggle to pay for things or to have enough money to make ends meet, the more expensive your life becomes, whether that's because you're opening credit cards with high interest rates, or you're being penalized on paying down debt that you do owe, or one of the things that drives me up the wall is that if you miss the deadline to renew your motor vehicle registration, you just get charged more money. Most people who are missing their motor vehicle registration renewals are people who are doing it because they can't afford to do it in the first place. So charging them more money is a bit cruel and nonsensical. And I think that like these are like small examples, but these things build up really quickly. I worry that like one of the things about this country and the direction that we're going is that there is like quickly decreasing access to tools that make it possible to escape that cycle. That assistance, no matter who it's for or where it's coming from, is becoming harder and harder to find. And that in fact, like the opportunities and the sort of like breaks that are designed into the system are starting to trend strongly towards and favor the folks who already have resources. I think too that like sometimes there are really like I think straightforward solutions to this problem. Like there are some studies that show that just giving people money is like actually a fine way to combat poverty. And we have this sort of like stereotype in this country that the poor are making bad choices. The fact of the matter is like poor people know what they need. They're very aware of what they need. And trusting poor people to make choices for themselves, I think, is something that we have a hard time with, sort of this like classically like American narrative of like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, but that I think is something that we really ought to reconsider now and have real conversations about, because like yeah, people know what they need. And I think that like conversations around how do we solve the housing crisis with existing homes are interesting questions. Universal basic income is an interesting question. And those are like, it feels hard to like have those conversations now because of how dire everything feels. But I really would like to see more people who are like not Silicon Valley millionaires taking up this question of universal basic income and really trying to examine what would make that possible. Because the fact of the matter is like the robots are coming, like all of our jobs are going to be obsolete very soon. And we're going to have to figure out a way to share wealth in new ways.
And that's like a perfect segue to what I was going to say, which is that, technology is taking over a lot of the jobs that some of the people who come from low-income families are doing, the ones that don't involve a higher degree in some cases. And so number one thing I always say is we need more affordable education, right? I mean, there are so many people who are in student debt, and then they're paying that off for the rest of their lives, and they did all the right things. They, like, quote unquote right things, being what a lot of people will say are the right things based on a model citizen, and they went to school and they did all the but they still ended up with all this debt, and they can't start their own families. And we know that millennials and the generations to come are buying houses later and later, if at all ever. And we are just pushing back that timeline because of how expensive education is. So if we made education more affordable, people could get the technical degrees they need, the education they need to kind of get out of those cyclical cycles of poverty. Another one is Medicaid and other healthcare initiatives, right? Obamacare was really good about at least removing pre-existing conditions and other things that really burdened families, where they were defaulting on payments for maybe their student loan debt or maybe their houses, but they needed to pay the medical bills because when it comes to health, that's going to most of the time have to be first. So that's another thing. Another is things like raising the minimum wage. Fight for 15 is a great campaign to get involved with. And it's about time that we at least raise the minimum wage a little bit to catch up with times and the inflation that we have. So those are three campaigns that I think are really important. Affordable education, healthcare, and Fight for 15 are three ways that we can give people the resources they need and the tools they need to help them get out of poverty and actually advance.
Very good points, and thank you for the resources. Our team in the back is like typing all of this so we can follow up. Yeah, it's very interesting with the talks of technology. I think I read an article on, it's either Wall Street or one of those financial articles, but they were saying that they're opening more jobs in the solar panel industry than they have with the coal industry, as well as some of the more being outdated industries. So it's very interesting to see that shift. And I do agree, if there were more educational programs to help with these technical degrees, that shift would be a lot easier in that transition versus is some people just not having any options at all. Moving on, we have another audience question, which is directed to the both of you. Have you ever been in a racist incident that has changed your life completely? And why?
So as I mentioned, I personally have not been a victim. I have had people in my community and my family be victims, and that's kind of how I got involved in the work in the first place. I personally knew victims of hate and bullying. I watched it around me right after 9/11, and I continue to do so. And it's a constant fear. But I will say, while I haven't had it happen due to my race or religion, it has happened plenty due to my gender. So I have dealt with sexism, sexual harassment, as most women have. You know, I feel like walking down the street alone any given week, you just never know what might happen, and it makes you very aware. And it just makes me want to fight harder. It makes me want to fight for awareness and education and the programs that would help people like me, or people who are less fortunate than me and dealing with more of it than I. And so it's all about taking that energy and turning it into a positive and making sure others aren't in the same boat.
Yeah, I don't really know how to answer this question. I feel like the way that I initially read it was like, have you ever been in a racist incident? It was super dramatic and like really sort of a flashpoint kind of experience. But you know, the more that I thought about it, the more I was like, a lot of my experiences with racism are really subtle, but that doesn't mean they didn't change my life completely. And I think that like, man, there's so many, I like don't even know what to dig into here. You know, I think that similar to Anisha, you know, I like so many of my routine experiences, and I think that, you know, I would venture to guess that a lot of my experiences around being targeted as a queer person are also being targeted as a queer person of color, that those two things are related to one another, you know. Yeah, I don't know that I have like a super like concrete story to share there. I'm like trying to think if there's something, and I'm like, I feel that feels a little too vulnerable. You know, I think that's like one of the other hard things about this. Is like I don't have like a polished up story that doesn't feel super vulnerable to tell. Because like, you know, ultimately some of these things are like super personal and like really, yeah, it's like hard to relate that experience quickly to folks. But follow me on Twitter because I'll probably tweet about it.
No, I totally, I feel you. It's always harder to talk about this face to face, but on the internet, when there are no faces to be put to,
on the
much
internet.
easier.
Yeah.
Yes, internet's a unique being. So this is a super simple question from Facebook. How do you both personally battle with daily microaggressions?
I mean, for me, it's just been about dealing with it. Has been about sort of surrounding myself with good people. You know, like I feel so lucky that, you know, I live in a place that's like so queer and so Asian in Oakland. I have like amazing friends who I know that if I'm feeling like totally beat down, like I can call them and we can talk about it, and they can not only commiserate, but you know, offer me like genuine words of support. I have a really fantastic partner My roommates are beautiful, wonderful humans. Yeah, I feel like incredibly privileged in that way, that I have this like support network that like when things like minor harmful things that happen all day, every day start to get to me, I have people to talk to in my life. And like, you know, it sounds so cliche, but like self-care is a real thing, you know, and I think that like there's a lot to be said for, I was actually, before we started this call, I was talking about acupuncture and how important it's been for me. And that like, it's for physical stuff, but it's also for like mental health purposes. And just like knowing when I've had enough, you know, I'm the kind of person who, like I can like put my really thick skin on, but like I'm like really deep down inside, super tender guy, you know? And, knowing what's going on with myself, and like what my limits are and what my triggers are, and knowing how to take care of myself when I have met that limit has been really important. Whether that's through seeing people or not seeing people, or feeding myself or whatever.
For me, I would say a lot of the times the microaggressions seem to be coming from people who are allies, and they actually don't realize that they're the ones adding to the problem. So for me, I try. It really just depends on the day. If I've had a long day at work where I have had to deal with a lot of seeing a lot of communities hurt, and then I come home and I have to deal with that from someone that I thought was a little bit more quote unquote woke than that, I might rely on my networks, and I might rely on them to have my back and correct the record for me. But 9 times out of 10, I think I kind of just tell them, hey, you know what you just did right there? Let me explain that to you. And I try to correct the record, because again, for me, they're usually trying to be allies. And if they really are, then they'll understand, and it'll help them for the future, so that someone else who might be in a more vulnerable spot or having that bad day that I just referenced doesn't have to deal with that. So definitely self-care when you need it. We can't always be defending ourselves, and we need to rely on our allies and our friends to do that when we can. But then also, I think, correcting the record when we can.
Working in the particular field that you do, Anisha, is there a good ratio of like men to women, or even race in that matter, or are you like still the minority in that environment?
Still the minority. I mean, it's definitely better than most places, but there's always room for improvement. I think no matter where I go, nonprofits, there tend to be a lot more individuals that can afford to have that salary, and that's usually not people of color, women of color, and sometimes it's not them also, because either they're not applying for those jobs, or they're not being selected for them. It's a real problem when you sometimes see individuals who don't, actually, this is a really good statistic that I saw a few years ago, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it. They said that women and people of color are less likely to apply to a job when they see that they don't qualify for like 9 out of the 10 things that are required to get to have that job. Whereas your typical white straight man will even just see 3 or 4 things out of that list of 10 and say, okay, I'm going to apply anyway, and I'm going to go ahead and do this. And it's that kind of thinking that I really do see happen a lot of the time in the spaces that I work, and even in progressive spaces where, you know, we kind of preach this lifestyle and this rhetoric where we don't sometimes practice it. So I do think there's a lot of diversity. I do think there's room for improvement, and I think continuing to raise that and continuing to challenge ourselves to be better about our diversity initiatives. We do have a diversity committee and initiative at our institution where we try and be better about it. And I think those are really important initiatives to intentionally go and correct ourselves, and again, check to see if we are doing the best we can.
Yeah. Well, I just got texted a question. So for the both of you, what is your biggest challenge so far being in your industry?
Oh, this is easy. Just the mental health, I think. at this point for me. After the election, I really had a hard time. I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating. If I was sleeping, it was really bad nightmares because of the amount of communities that I knew were about to be affected. The statistics were coming, the hate crimes were increasing, the healthcare was at risk, this and that, the people being appointed into the administration, I knew their records in and out, and they were just terrifying. The EPA was going to lose funding. We knew all these things. And it was just so overwhelming, and it still is. There are days where I am not handling it well. So I would say that would be the biggest challenge, is how do you navigate this new space? I am young enough where really the first president I had when I started getting involved in this work was President Obama. And I was fortunate that, it just happened to be that his platform values agenda lined up with mine. So I kind of just pushed that, and to go into complete resistance, defense, protection mode is hard enough. But I think this is a kind of different beast where we have to be careful. And, like it was said earlier, self-care, taking it one day at a time, telling myself that I can't do it all, and I can only do what I can and put my best effort and hope that it sticks, and I'll try again tomorrow. And so getting better at it. It's still fresh, but I will say that is the big thing, that every day I have to check myself and make sure that I am taking care of my mental health.
Yeah, that's huge. For me, I think right now, so I'm a new executive director. This is June will be my 9th month of being in charge. And so like I've often said to people that it takes me about 9 months to figure out what my job even really is when I take on a new role. And I honestly think that like the biggest challenge that I've been experiencing has been trying to balance building a sustainable organization, doing this fundraising work, and building in like long term for the future, while also like feeling the urgency of the moment. And I think that like there are a lot of things that go into that, and part of that is that like the foundation funding model is like totally messed up. And we rely on their grants because it's also very hard to fundraise from the grassroots. But at the same time, often like the work that I have to put into raising money is, that's sometimes the only work that I do in a week. And it's like painful, it's like trying to package these like big ideas that we have about the way that the world should work into an acceptable sort of grant proposal is like, it feels like it's sometimes actually like physically painful. And trying to balance the sort of values and ideals that got me into this work in the first place, while trying to like run an organization that pays its folks, that is like takes care of people while also addressing issues, is really hard work. I've been telling people that I think this is the hardest job that I ever hope to have, because it is like, I feel like I'm constantly walking this tightrope between idealist Caden and like business Caden, and I don't know that I like business Caden that much. But I also believe that, like my staff, who's like largely like folks with multiply marginalized identities like myself, like we deserve good healthcare, we deserve market rate pay. And like I'm, in addition to fighting for these broader social justice issues, I'm fighting for that. I'm fighting for my staff. And yeah, it's hard. It's hard.
Well, I have to say that I respect the both of you so much and what you've contributed to our communities. I do UNAVSA work as a volunteer part-time thing, and sometimes it does feel like a full-time job and a free full-time job. But the fact that you two are being independent and on top of that just serving the community continuously, it's pretty amazing, and thank you. I think we have time for one last question before I make some closing remarks. I feel like 1.5 hours just flew by really quickly. So one last question from YouTube. On the cause to raising minimum wage, while it sounds great, what are the negative economic impacts of doing this, and do the positives outweigh those negative impacts?
There, to me, are no negatives. If you are paying your employees well, they will do better work, and then they will be able to maybe take the day off when they're sick and not come in and get everyone else sick. There are all these repercussions that come from not taking care of your employees. And I think it helps stimulate the economy. I personally don't believe trickle-down economics works. So if you agree with that, then you agree that by giving the corporation more or the employer more and taking it away from the employee is not going to work. Whereas if we give it to the employee, give them the money that they deserve, we can stimulate the economy better. So that's just kind of like my brief take on it. I know people have different views as to how the economy should work, but I'm a true believer that, and it was mentioned earlier, if you give people who can actually value money, who actually value every dollar that you're giving them, they will put it to things that matter. They will put it to things that are important, and you can probably get a quote unquote return on your investment better that way than people that kind of wouldn't appreciate it as much.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Anisha and Caden, for being on our panel, and I hope to continue this discussion with hopefully in Solidarity 2.0 with even more panelists for perspective and whatnot. Yes, thank you so much for being on this panel, and if anybody is watching this live panel, if you want to reach out to our panelists, please do. They are on our Facebook event page, as well as if they would like to provide some personal contact information if you're interested in the work that they do, as well as the mission. And also thank you for 18 Million Rising for co-sponsoring this webinar tonight. A second giant thank you to the UNAVSA community for your continuous support and the participation for the #IAM campaign for this APIA Heritage Month and all the webinars and events. It's been incredibly humbling to be part of this great community, and I'm so glad to see more voices being heard and more stories being told.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for having us. This is great.
Yeah, absolutely. One last announcement. We have our 2017 VSA Awards coming up, and the deadline is 5 days away. So if you're nominating your VSAs, please do so quickly. And then, yeah, stay tuned for our summer lineup of events and webinars. And one last thing, I guess in response to the ever-changing political climate, as well as the heavy issues that our community is facing, the UNAVSA organization is opening up a civic engagement committee that's going to tackle and research and work with these other wonderful orgs that we've made partnerships with to obtain objective information to put out there so that people are more educated, people are more involved, and hopefully we get not only discussions, but some pretty amazing accomplishments through these campaigns. So thank you once again for joining us tonight. Thank you, Nisha. Thank you, Caden. And good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.